hiking or camping and you saw these animal tracks, would you know which ones could potentially be dangerous and cause you harm? Or what if you were lost in the wilderness for several days and hadn't eaten? Would you know which ones could be a potential food source? Hi, I'm Lee, the outside professor, and in this video I'm going to show you how to reliably recognize the 10 most important animal tracks in the world so that you can feel safe in your surroundings no matter where you are. I'll teach you exactly what features to look for to identify the most feared species that could spell your downfall, as well as the ones that could save your life. These are the same secrets that I pass on to my university students for quickly and accurately determining what animals are nearby. Before we get started, make sure to click on the link in the description below to download the free resource that covers everything I'm going to talk about and much more. There's nothing comparable to what you'll find in this resource, as I've compiled the information that's contained in thousands of pages of field guides into this one download, saving you hundreds of hours and enabling you to take it with you on your smart device anytime you venture into the wild. Now let's get going.
Let's take a look at feline tracks and the characteristics you look for to identify them and differentiate them from other species. So when we're analyzing feline tracks, we're talking both about all of the big felines, so lions, tigers, cheetahs, leopards, jaguars, but also the smaller felines, so bobcats, ocelots, fishing cats, or many varieties all over the world. They all have the same basic features, okay? There is a difference in size, obviously, so the larger felines are going to have much larger track than the smaller felines, but these same characteristics you'll find in all of them. So let's go through that now and what that looks like. Okay, the first thing you want to notice when you come up to a track to try to determine and you think it might be a feline is you'll notice that the front track is going to be larger and rounder than a hind track, okay? And that's always the case. Again, the biggest part of the weight of the animal with the head and the chest is going to be on the front foot, so they need to have a bigger surface area to support that. And you'll see on the front foot, which is the top photo here, this is a front right track and a right hind below it, you'll see that we have a leading toe in that front track, okay? And that's very typical with feline tracks on the front foot. You'll have one toe, it's on the inside of the animal, so again, that's a right foot that sticks above the other toes. You can see the inner toe next to it is slightly below that, okay? Whereas in the hind foot, you could actually draw a line, a horizontal line that's almost level between the two toes, okay? There might be a slight difference, but you're not going to have nearly as much of a toe sticking above one of the other ones. Now also, these tracks are considered asymmetrical, particularly the front track, okay? So if I drew a line down the middle of this track, and I look at the left-hand side of the track versus the right-hand side, I would see they're not mirror images. They're not going to match up, okay? The hind track is less asymmetrical if you look at the bottom there and compare it to the front track above, but it's not quite symmetrical, so we still have some slight asymmetry there. And you'll always find this with feline tracks. Then also, you want to look at the shape of the toes. Okay, this is really key in differentiating with other animals who also have 4 toes, which is what all felines have. And you'll see they're teardrop shaped or tapered. So they're going to be a little more round and wide at the bottom, and they're going to come not quite to a point, but they're going to narrow down at the top. Again, it depends on the track and the substrate. Sometimes they may appear to be a little more oval, but typically you're going to get this teardrop shape on both the front track above and you see the hind below it. And then also, you want to look for the negative space, okay? So again, differentiating felines from other animals who have 4 toes is going to be this area between the toes and the palm pad, and we refer to that as negative space. So if I draw a line here, on the front track, we'll see it's sort of a circle or an arc. Okay, maybe not perfect, but you could draw a nice little arc across the top of the palm pad, and you would have this negative space where nothing registers below those toes. So you always want to look for that in felines. In other animals, it's going to be a different shape, but in felines, you'll see this arc. And then another really key thing that can make felines stand out from just about any other species is the shape of the palm pad, okay? Felines have what we call a trapezoidal, or some people say an M-shaped palm pad. So if I outline it here with this blue line, you'll see that it forms almost like an M shape inside or an upside down W, okay? And that's because I typically will get what's called bilobed on the top. I've got 2 humps on the top, and oftentimes you'll see 3 on the bottom, okay? Now, some species don't show the bottom as much, but in many other species, you will see clearly those 3 lobes on the bottom, and that is classic feline, okay? It's very different from other species that have 4 toes, so this is something that you always want to look for as soon as you find a track and you think that it might be a feline. Another thing to look for is that relative size of the toes to the palm pad are such that you can pretty much pack them into the palm pad. In other words, if you were to move them down in terms of area, you could actually see that the toes will literally fit inside the space of the palm pad, okay? The palm pad is that big where the toes would comfortably fit inside. Again, that's different from other species. Okay, you won't see that in canines, for an example. So this is a great way, because sometimes it can be very confusing to differentiate between the two, but these differences in the palm pad are an easy way to do that. And then a couple other things you want to notice when you're looking at feline tracks and trying to determine if that's what it is that their toes flex on their foot. And what that means is that the toes, depending on the substrate and what they're doing, can spread out until you can get a larger track with more negative space. And we kind of see that in the upper photo here with this front foot. Or sometimes they're going to be more compressed and closer together. Really depends on what the animal's doing and whether it's sinking down deep, it needs to get more traction. And similarly, you're not going to see, almost never see any claws or nail marks. And that's because felines have retractable nails. And they're only going to use that in an event like if they're springing, they're ambushing prey, or maybe in really slippery or deep substrate where they need to get better footing. Otherwise, you're not going to see nail marks. And you'll notice at the top of each of these toes, we don't see any nails. Okay, so again, that's something that's a key clue to tell you that you're likely looking at a feline track. Let's look now at some examples of feline tracks from different species. And keep in mind that the larger the feline, the larger the track's going to be, so you can look in a field guide to figure out, the rough measurements, which is always a good thing to do if you have multiple cat species in an area. So here's a mountain lion track, and it's just a classic looking front track. Okay, we have a leading toe. If I draw a line down the middle, you can see the left side would not match up with the right. I've also got a very large palm pad. The palm pads are bigger on the fronts and on the hinds, and you could see that those toes, those teardrop-shaped toes, would easily fit inside that palm pad. So compare that here to a jaguar track. This is a hind track. Jaguars in particular, it's a little meatier track, not quite as sharp edges, but you can also see it's got classic canine characteristics. Now, because it's a hind track, there's not as much asymmetry, but still a little bit. If I compare the left-hand side to the right-hand side, again, it's a hind track. Palm pad's going to be a little bit smaller, but those toes would still just about fit inside that palm pad. Okay, if I look at a bobcat front here, again, very large palm pad compared to those toes, and definitely a trapezoidal shaped palm pad. I could fit all of those teardrop shaped toes inside of that very easily. Again, very asymmetrical because it's a front foot, so comparing left to right, there's a clear difference if I drew a line down the middle. Here's a tiger hind in the lower left here. And again, you can see just slight asymmetry if I draw a line down the middle. And also you can see that it's a slightly smaller palm pad relative to the size of the overall track and the toes, but that I can fit all of those toes inside there. And you can see, like with all of these tracks, if I drew a line in that negative space between the palm pad and the toes, I get this nice arc or C shape between that. So again, very classic for felines. And I can see the trilobes on the bottom of that palm pad very clearly. Here's an African lion. Again, it's a hind track, so not a lot of asymmetry, just a bit. I can see the lobes on the bottom. And again, I can clearly fit those toes inside that palm pad, even though it's a hind foot. And then finally, we have a house cat track here. And they're a little different being domesticated. The palm pad's size relative to the toes is not quite as large, but I can still just about fit those toes in. Toes oftentimes on house cats are a little more oval than they are teardrop shaped, but you can see it does have a trapezoidal shaped palm pad, and all the other characteristics are pretty much the same. This is a front foot, okay? It's going to be considerably smaller than one of the larger felines, but the overall shape and characteristics are the same. Let's look now at canine tracks, the features you want to look for to identify them and differentiate them from other species. So when we're looking at canine tracks, we're talking about wolves, coyotes, foxes, any other wild dog species, and even domestic dogs. There's a few differences with them, but they all have the same basic characteristics. And the first thing is, when you come up to a set of tracks that you think might be a canine, you'll notice that the front tracks will be considerably bigger than the hinds, and really especially in the width. They're overall just rounder and wider, and you can see that with the front track at the top here versus the hind track underneath it is just much narrower. It's a tighter track. The other thing you'll see is that, again, if you draw a line down the middle, you'll notice that there's mostly symmetry between the left-hand side and the right-hand side, okay? So again, that's different from other species like felines. It's not an exact mirror image, but it's very, very close. And then you'll also notice always on canines they have 4 toes, okay? They're going to be either oval or round shape, okay? Same on the front as it is the hind. Some species are a little more round, some are a little more oval, and it depends on the substrate. But they're not going to be typically tapered. They're just going to be this kind of oval shape, not so much teardrop. Also, another key distinguishing characteristic is that between canines and other species with 4 toes is that the outer toes lie beneath or under the inner toes. And you can see that here. If you look at the orange line on both the front foot and the hind foot, you'll see that where the inner toes end is where the outer toes start, okay? They don't really overlap. Again, that's different from felines and some other species. So if you draw a line there and you see that, that's a key feature to look for to help you positively identify that it's a canine. Also, you'll see that the outer toes are tucked in relatively close to the center line compared to other species. They're not spread out extremely wide, especially in this hind track that you can see that. You know, if you drew a line down the middle, you'll see that toe is very close to the center line. Where some other species like cat, it's going to be farther out typically. And then you'll also see that if you draw a line between the negative space, and again, that's where nothing really registers, that area between the toes and the palm pad, that on the front foot, you'll typically get this sort of angled H shape. And you can see it here with these purple lines, right? And you'll always want to look for that with canines on the front foot, and sometimes even on the front foot, but especially on the hind foot, it may be more like an X. And you can see that here, but you can just clearly draw that out. In other species, it's going to be more of an arc shape, but if you see this where you get that almost X or angled H shape, then it's very likely going to be a canine. The palm pad on canines is triangular shaped. So if I were to sketch a line around that palm pad, I'll see I really only have one lobe at the top and then two corners underneath. So again, that's different from other species that may be more trapezoidal or a wider shaped pad. In canines, you'll always get this triangle, and you'll also always see that it's going to be bigger in the front foot, and usually it's quite a bit bigger, particularly in wild canines. You can see that here, that the palm pad is much larger in the front foot above than it is in the hind foot below. And then the last thing we want to look for are nail marks. So canines, most species, there's a couple of exceptions, but typically you're going to see nails reliably register, especially in deep substrate. And you can see in pink here on both the front and the hind nail marks that register right above the toes. Okay, again, there's one or two exceptions to this, but that's very different from, say, feline species where you'll almost never see nail marks register. And then finally, if we're looking at the relative area between the toes and the palm pad, we'll see that you can't fit all of those toes inside the palm pad, especially on the hind foot. There's just not enough area. The surface area of those toes far exceeds the area of the palm pad. But in the front as well, you really can't pack them in there. And so again, that's a distinguishing feature of canines and something you can use to reliably identify them. Let's look now at some examples from actual canine species and where you can see these features. So the first one here is a wolf track. You can see that it's actually very symmetrical. If I draw a line down the middle, I've got four toes, I've got a triangular shaped palm pad, the left matches up to the right, and I clearly see nail marks. Now again, wolves are bigger species, so this is going to be a big track. Again, have a field guide with you if you're trying to differentiate between other species like coyotes or foxes, but the wolf is going to be the biggest of all the canine tracks, and that's a front foot. Here's the front foot of a coyote in comparison. So again, very symmetrical, oval-shaped toes. I can see the nail marks, a big palm pad relative, to a hind foot. And again, it's just going to be a smaller track. It's going to be a little more aerodynamic than a gray wolf track, which is going to be a little bigger and also a little rounder than a coyote track. Here's a red fox, and one of the first things to see with this red fox track is that it's not as clearly delineated, the features and the toes, and that's because their feet are full of fur, okay? The other thing to notice is for the palm pad, there is a triangle, but it's harder to make out, and instead you've got this chevron, this mark that goes horizontal across the track, the palm pad, and that's very common only in the front foot, but you'll see that in red foxes. But even with the fur, you can still see four toes and some little nails showing. Here's a gray fox. This is a hind of a gray fox. You can see it's a little more narrow and long versus wide. You can see the oval-shaped toes. One thing that's noticeably missing are nail marks, and that's because a gray fox is a species that has what's called semi-protractable claws. So there, a lot of times, in most cases, you're not going to see the claw marks, and it's easy to confuse with cats, and that's why you want to look for other features. You can see a triangular-shaped palm pad. It's smaller here because this is a hind. You could draw an X through the negative space, and you can see the outer toes are underneath the inner toes, and that's how you would differentiate from a feline. Here's a European wolf here. So again, a very big meaty track, triangular shaped palm pad. You can see that the nails clearly register, and so very different from a cat species and very similar to the gray wolf above it, which is the North American variety. Here's an African wild dog. Again, classic canine characteristics, oval-shaped toes, nails register, mostly symmetrical, and a triangular-shaped palm pad. And then finally, we have a domestic dog. And There's a couple of differences with domestic dog species. One is they're typically a lazier track, so the toes a lot of times will splay more, may not be quite as symmetrical. The other key thing is that even though you have the triangular shaped palm pad and more or less oval shaped toes, you have big kind of fat blunt nails. And that's classic of domestic dogs because they don't use their nails nearly as much, at least most of them don't, for digging, so they're not as sharp. It can be very difficult to tell the difference with wild canines, but in many cases you can clearly see the difference by that kind of lazy shape overall of the track and the blunt nail marks. Let's take a look at bear tracks now and the key features you want to look for to reliably identify them. So when we're looking at bear track characteristics, we want to realize there's many species of bears, and they're actually common in multiple continents. So these include brown bears, black bears, polars, but also sloth bears, Himalayan black bears, sun bears, a number of different varieties. They all share similar characteristics. Again, the size may be a little different. Polar bear obviously is going to be the largest, but they're all large animals generally speaking, and they have the same general characteristics. Okay, so the first thing we want to note with bears is that different from many other species, their hind track is actually larger than the front track, and you can see that here. The front above in the top photo and the hind below, and you can see clearly because of a heel pad that the hind track has, it's a much bigger track, okay? Both the front and hind tracks are also a little bit asymmetrical. So if I draw a line down the middle here, you can see that the left-hand side does not match up. It's not a mirror image with the right-hand side, okay? And again, that's true on both the front track and the hind track. Bears have 5 round, or what we oftentimes refer to as oblong toes, and they're always close together, okay? And you'll see that it forms an arc around the top of the palm pad, and that's true on both the front foot and the hind foot, as you can see here. So it forms kind of a ring around the top of that palm pad, and if you draw a line there between the toes and the palm pad, you get this arc. Okay, one of the key differentiators between bears and human feet, because a lot of times people see this, particularly the hind foot, and they say, that looks just like a human foot. Well, actually, the low toe is on the inside of the track. So these are both right feet, but you can see here that that inside toe is a low toe. On humans, that would be our big toe, and that's probably because we walk upright exclusively. Bears will some, but most of the time they're on all fours, and so they don't need that huge toe that sticks out above. So you'll see that on both the front and the hind track, that the low toe is on the inside of the track. The palm pad is also going to be curved, and it's going to be wider on the outside of the track. So even if you weren't sure about which was the low toe, you could look at that palm pad, particularly on the front, but also on the hind, and you can see that it's wider on the outside of the track. Again, these are right feet, than it is on the inside of the track. So that's a way to tell right from left. Bears typically will have large blunt claws that, if it's in any kind of deep substrate, will register. And you can see that on both the front and the hind foot, these toenails that clearly register on top of the toes. The front track also has a heel pad. At first, it's easy to miss a lot of times, but it's a small circle. You can see it here in orange. Again, it infrequently registers. In many cases, you won't see it because you're just not looking for it. But if you look, a lot of times you'll see it's literally just a round dot below the palm pad with a lot of negative space in between, okay, which is very different from the hind foot, which has a full heel pad, okay, and it's reliably registers. You'll always see it. Again, you can see it here. It looks very much like a human heel, and again, with the exception of that low toe being on the inside, it's very similar to a human foot in many respects. And then finally, bears have very little negative space between the toes and the palm pad. Okay, so there's that arc, but when it is, when you notice it, you'll oftentimes see in the right substrate like mud that hair registers. So even though it's small, you'll see that it's full of hair. And if you look closely, you can see that. And again, it's a really key feature to help recognize and reliably identify bear tracks. Let's look now at some actual examples of bear species. So the first one we have is an American black bear. And this is a front track. There's no heel pad showing. You can see the 5 toes across the top. If you look carefully, there is a low toe on the inside, which is a right foot. Okay, these are all going to be right feet. And you can see that palm pad is wider to the outside than it is to the inside. Okay, and you can also see, if you look closely, some nail marks there. You can contrast that to the hind foot, where clearly we see a heel pad showing here, okay? And this is from a grizzly bear. One of the small differences between the two is that for grizzlies, the toes are more in a line across the top. We have less of an arc between the toes and the palm pad. Clearly see nail marks showing here, low toe again on the inside. This is a right foot. And again, look at the similarities between this and a polar bear, okay? Polar bear is the biggest of all the tracks. This, again, is a hind, okay? You're not going to get as much definition typically with the polar bear track because they have lots of fur on their feet, obviously to stay warm. But you can still see both the palm pad and the hind pad, 5 toes, low toe on the inside, and the nail marks. Here's a European brown bear, okay? So very similar to the grizzly bear above it. They're closely related. You can see obviously 5 toes and clearly see the nail marks on this one. Very sharp nails, as well as, again, that heel pad that registers. And finally, we've got a hind foot of an Asian sloth bear, okay? I like this one because you can really see the delineation between the palm pad and the heel pad there. 5 toes. You notice you don't see the nail marks nearly as close to the toes, and that's because sloth bears have really long toenails for digging, so they register above the toe quite a bit. Okay, but again, classic in terms of its bear characteristics, and you can see here that there's an arc between the toes and the palm pad, and just a slight curvature there, like with all the other bear species. Let's take a look at crocodilian tracks and the key features you want to use to reliably identify them and distinguish them from other species. So in crocodilian tracks, we're talking about alligators, crocodiles, caimans, gharials, and any other crocodilian species across the planet. Okay, they all have the same basic characteristics, and here's what you're going to look for. Okay, first of all, the hind tracks are a lot larger than the front tracks, and that's due because they have this large heel, which you can see here in the red outline. So again, we've got the hind track in the below photo and the front track above. And so there's a big difference. They really don't look anything alike. Okay, also you'll notice that the tracks are very asymmetrical. Okay, so if I draw a line down the middle, you can see particularly in the front track up above that the left-hand side and the right-hand side do not match up at all. And even in the hind foot, it's still quite asymmetrical. Okay, there's a big difference between the left and the right. The front foot has what we call 5 cigar-shaped toes, okay? And it almost looks a little bit like human fingers, except they're more pointed on that. And the third toe from the center line, again, these are right feet, so if I count from left to right, that would be the third toe. That's going to typically be what we call the leading or the highest toe, and you can see that here outlined in yellow. Okay, on the hind foot, we only have 4 toes. Okay, so this is different from some other species. We don't have the same number of toes on the front and the hind. Okay, and the middle 2 toes, the second and third toe, are going to be the leading ones, which you can see here outlined in yellow. So again, this is a right foot, and they're going to be roughly the same height. Okay, and well above the 2 outer toes. The front foot is also going to be angled about 45 degrees okay, from the horizontal. So if I draw a line up that first toe, that inside toe, it's going to point up and to the center line of the animal, okay, at about a 45-degree angle. Whereas if I take that fifth toe, okay, and that's the orange line you can see there, the inner toe, toe 1, is the blue line, but if we look at the outer toe, that's going to point to the outside of the animal, okay, and back into the outside. So we can see that here, okay. On the hind foot, toe 4, the outside toe, is going to be the lowest. And also, we have a large amount of negative space between the third toe and the fourth toe, okay? More so than between the other toes. So if you were concerned trying to identify between left or right, or just in general you weren't sure that this was a hind foot of an alligator or crocodile species versus some other species, that's a good way to tell, is that negative space. And you can see that here in the purple between the third toe and the fourth toe. Also, if you get a really good impression, and it depends on the substrate, a lot of times this is going to be in mud or on wet sand because obviously they're going to be near water, you might see scales in the actual track, okay? But one thing you almost always see is the claws register. And you can see in pink here on this front foot, you can see a claw mark here on the extension of that toe, and you can also see it on a first toe here in the hind foot. Okay, so those almost will always show up. And then finally, oftentimes you can make out webbing between the toes. It's not always going to be there, but in many cases you'll see it. And also in the center line, you may see a tail drag. Obviously, they have very long, heavy tails, so depending on the substrate, the age, weight of the animal, you want to look for that because, again, that's a key feature you can use to help differentiate from other animals that might have similar looking tracks. So let's take a look now at some example tracks for crocodiles and alligators and other crocodilians. So the first one we have here is an alligator front. Again, you can see 5 toes. You can see the angle. This is a right foot again. And you can see that sort of 45-degree angle of the first toe pointing up into the center line, the outer toe pointing back into the outside, okay? We can contrast that with the hind foot of the alligator, and you can see here that large heel pad. Okay, it looks like a human heel. Only 4 toes on this one versus 5 on the front. Again, this is a right foot. You can see those inner 2 toes are the leading toes, and the big negative space between the third toe and the fourth toe on the outside on the right edge of the track. Okay, again, compare that to an American crocodile hind. Again, very similar. You can actually see scales in this track, which is really cool, in the heel area. Again, 4 toes. You can see, again, that large negative space between the fourth toe on the far right and the third toe. Here's a salt crocodile from Australia. It's a hind foot as well. Again, you can see the scales clearly registering here in this sand. And again, you can see 4 toes with, again, being a right foot, that outer toe on the right-hand side of the track, and the larger negative space, the separation between the other 3 toes. And finally here, this is from a caiman. This is a spectacle caiman. This is a front foot. Okay, and you can see again 5 toes. You can see that angle. It's a right foot again. You can see that first toe pointing up into the inside and that 5th toe pointing back into the outside. So a great example of a front foot and how different it is from the hind foot on crocodilian species. Let's take a look at deer and antelope tracks and the key features you want to look for to reliably identify them and distinguish them from other similar species. So when we're looking at deer and antelope tracks, the first thing we want to note is that we're talking about all deer species, from the smallest like a brocket deer or Coues whitetail all the way up to elk and moose, as well as pronghorn, which are in their own family, and antelope species all across Africa and Asia. They all have, generally speaking, very similar characteristics. All these features we talk about are going to pertain to all of these. Okay, and the first thing we want to make note of is that the front tracks in any of these species are going to be larger than the hind tracks, and that's again because they have to support more weight. They got to support the chest cavity as well as the head, and it's particularly true in mature males because they also have to support antler growth or horns. In antelopes. Okay, so you're always going to see that front track is going to be larger than the hind. And sometimes that's hard to tell if you have a bunch of different tracks, because it might be one animal's larger than the other. But if you have one set of tracks, you want to look for that. Additionally, we'll see that these tracks are symmetrical. So if we draw a line down the middle, the left-hand side is almost going to be an identical mirror image of the right-hand side. Might be minor differences due to uneven ground or deeper substrate, but generally speaking, the left-hand side is going to look just like the right-hand side. Okay. Also, all species of deer and antelope have two toes, okay, that are going to register every time, again, assuming that you have good substrate, and they're going to be teardrop shaped or maybe oval. So they're going to be round at the bottom, but most importantly, they're going to come to a point at the top. And that's different from some other ungulates like wild boars, a pig family, who are not going to have that point at the top. So this is a key feature to look for both in the front track as shown above and the hind track down below. They're both going to have these teardrop shaped toes. Then the other thing we want to notice is that the toes are going to be convex on the outer wall. We can see that with the orange line here. And the inner wall is going to be concave. And you can see that here in the hind track down below. Again, there's going to be a little bit of differences between species. Some will be more convex on the outside and some more or less concave on the inside. But to some degree that they're going to have this, generally speaking, in each track that you look at. Also, probably the defining characteristic when you come up to one or more set of deer antelope tracks is to look for this upside down heart shape. Okay, so if I take this heart, I turn it upside down and I put it on top of the track, we'll see it almost perfectly matches the outline of the track. Okay, and that's almost always true with one exception. When an animal is either galloping or in deep substrate, the toes sometimes will splay. And we can see that in the hind track below. Okay, and the reason for that is just anatomically speaking, those toes are going to spread out to give better support to the animal when it's having to push off, when it's running fast or in soft, deeper substrate. And so sometimes we will see, as this blue line shows, greater negative space between the two toes, that V there. They'll spread out a little bit. But in most other cases, you're going to see that classic heart shape, and it's a very reliable way to quickly know that you're looking at a deer or antelope species. Another key thing to look for, and it doesn't always show up, but is to look for dew claws, okay? And these are claws that are higher up on the leg, so they don't always register. But when they do, you're going to see them in the front track. They're going to be behind the toes, and they're going to point to the horizontal, okay? And the other key thing is that the distance between them is going to be closer to the toes than what you're actually going to see in the hind foot. So you can see that pink arrow there. There's not that much distance between where the dew claw lands in the front. Okay, if we look at the hind track here, we're going to see that the dew claw, first of all, is oriented more to the vertical, and you can see a clear difference between that and the front track. Okay, but also we can see the distance is greater from where the toe ends to where the dew claw starts. The reason this is important is that you might see, for example, a fairly large deer track, and then you notice that, hey, I have a dew claw, it's oriented to the vertical, it's farther back. Well, that means this is a hind track. So this is a really big deer because the front track's going to be even larger, which tells you it's likely going to be a mature male. So not only is it a good feature to help analyze and identify the species, but also tells you something about the individual. And finally, what we want to make note of is that dew claws in deer and antelope species register directly underneath the toes. So if I put lines around the dew claws, you'll see that it lines up underneath the toes, both in the front track above and the hind track below, okay? And that's always characteristic of deer and antelope species. That's not true of some other ungulates, particularly like wild boars and pigs, okay? They do not register directly underneath the toes. So this is a very important feature to remember in helping positively identify deer and antelope. Let's look at a few examples of deer and antelope tracks from different species. So here we have a white-tailed deer. This is a hind track, classic looking deer track. It's got the upside down heart shape. You can see the toes come to a point, teardrop shape. The rear or posterior edge is rounded. You can see the convex outer wall and the concave inner wall. So this is just a classic looking track, okay? Here's a mule deer, okay? First appearance, it's very different because this is not the heart shape. You can see that it's splayed, and that's because it was in deep substrate. But everything else is similar. The toes come to a point, they're teardrop shaped, the posterior edge of them is round. What you also see, again, because it was deep substrate, is that the dew claws registered. Typically, when dew claws registered, the track is going to splay, again, because it's either deep substrate or the animal was galloping. And you can see this is actually a front foot because those dew claws are pointed to the horizontal, okay? If it was a hind foot, they'd be more to the vertical, and they're fairly close to the toes above them, okay? So if it's a hind foot, there would be more space between them. Here's a Rocky Mountain elk. This is a hind track. Again, general overall shape, we have a little bit of splay in this one, so doesn't quite have the heart shape as much. But again, we can see the toes come to a point. We have the teardrop shape, and they're round on the posterior edge. Definitely convex, a little bit more so in this species on the outside of the toe, and still some concavity on the inner wall. Here's a moose hind, okay? So again, very much a heart shape. These guys are the largest in the deer family. Teardrop shape coming to a point at the top, round on the posterior edge. So again, just classic looking deer family track. This is a pronghorn. They're a little bit different in that the outer wall is not as convex, so it kind of narrows down more to a point at the top of the track. And you can see that here, a little bit more of a straight edge. There is a slight convex shape, but it's hard to see. But we still have the overall heart shape. The tips are pointed of the toes, and again, the posterior edge is round. This is a roan antelope, a front. These guys are from Africa. Again, just classic looking, sort of deer track shape, even though it's an antelope. Same characteristics, posterior edge is round and tapered down to a point in the front. And finally, here's a black buck antelope. This is a hind track. Again, kind of like the pronghorn, which was a front here. But you see, we don't have as much convexity in the outer wall. But the overall track shape is still heart-shaped, again, round posterior edge and coming to a point in the front. So all of these show the same features, even though there's slight variations between each of them.
If you're enjoying this content and want more in-depth knowledge, visit our website, naturaliststudies.com. It's listed in the description below, and you can find our full range of courses along with other valuable resources like podcasts. You can also sign up for our newsletter and receive regular information on topics directly related to this subject and others on a variety of naturalist topics. They will not only teach you practical skills, but also will heighten your connection to nature while increasing your enjoyment of the outdoors.
Let's examine wild boar tracks now and the features you need to look for to reliably identify them and differentiate them from other species. When we're discussing the tracks of wild boars, we're talking about a number of different species, including feral hogs. Now, they're a mixture of wild pig species and their domestic counterparts. Okay, very common in many parts of the world. We're also talking about the New World pigs, the wild versions of those, which are peccaries and javelinas, as well as other wild pig species in Asia and Africa, even in Europe, and even domestic pigs all have these features that we're going to take a look at here. So the first thing we want to note is that the front tracks are slightly larger than the hinds, but not significantly so. They do have to support the extra weight of the chest cavity and the head, but obviously pig species don't have antlers or horns on them, so they're not going to be as big a difference as you're going to see in deer and antelope. The other thing to note is if I draw a line down the middle, the tracks are symmetrical. So the left-hand side is going to almost be identical to the right-hand side of the track. Again, there'll be some slight variation because of the substrate and how the animal landed, but they're almost always going to match up. Then also we always want to note that when we come up to a track, look at the number of toes, and we're going to see for wild boars, they have 2 toes. Okay, you're always going to see that register, and they're going to be oval, usually kind of oblong and round on both ends. Okay, so just like with any ungulates, you're going to see 2 toes register, and that's on the front track, which you see here above, as well as the hind. They're going to look almost identical. Again, some slight variation depending on each individual and each track, but they're always going to have that general appearance. And then the other thing we want to note, and this is a really key factor to differentiate from deer and antelope species, is that the top of the toes are blunt. Okay, they're rounded rather than coming to a point, than tapering down and having that teardrop shape. And you can see that here in the front track. It's just a slow, gentle curvature across the top. The same thing in the hind track down below. Okay, so it just doesn't taper nearly as much as you see in deer or antelope species. Also, you're going to see that they do splay some, and you'll get some negative space between the 2 toes. You can see that here between those blue lines. It's sort of a V-shaped appearance, but they won't splay as much and spread out as much on deep substrate as deer or antelope will. So you can see that negative space doesn't go all the way down between the toes. And again, you'll see that it curves up gently rather than coming to a point at the top. And because of this, if you outline the entire track, you get this sort of Pac-Man-like appearance, okay? If you remember the old video game, and so because of that V-shaped, it's almost like the 2 toes are squeezing together. So that's just a really easy mnemonic to help remember and differentiate again between deer and antelope species. Another aspect, again, and this is generally speaking more or less universal among any ungulates, is you'll have this curved outside toe that's convex on the outside, and then on the inside of the toe, it's going to be somewhat concave. And you can see that here with both of those orange lines in the front track. And in the hind track, it's going to be the same thing, no difference there. Also, again, the overall track shape has this kind of round appearance, and if you want to use that Pac-Man analogy, but it's not going to have that heart shape appearance. Okay, so again, that's something when you come up, it can be very easy to confuse the tracks of deer and antelope with any kind of wild boar species. But this is one of the first things you look for, is that more round overall shape versus that heart shape that tapers down near the top on both of the toes. And then another key aspect for a wild boar species, and something you can use to confidently identify them, are the location of the dew claws when they register. So they're going to appear in the front foot, just like they do in deer and antelope species. They're going to point more to the horizontal than they do in the hind foot, which you see here below, dew claw, which is pointing more to the vertical. But a key fact that's different between them is the position of those dew claws relative to the toes above them. So we can see here that the dew claw in this front foot, a good portion of it lies outside of the toe of the front foot. And sometimes the entire thing, the way it will register, will be outside almost the entire toe. And you can see that here in the hind foot below, where that dew claw is outside. So to put it simply, they're going to be wider, spaced out wider. They will not be directly under the toes like you find in deer and antelope species. So that is another very key point to help you differentiate between the two. Let's take a look now at some actual examples of wild boar tracks. So the first one we have here is a feral hog. This is a front from North America. And again, you can see that the tips of the toes are still curved. They don't come to quite as much of a point. Now, I picked this one intentionally because it does look like they taper a little bit, but if you get down in there and look closely, you'll see they're very rounded on the tip ends. Also, you'll see in the negative space there, it's got that kind of Pac-Man-like appearance, okay, and all the other typical aspects that you would get in a boar track, which is the convex outer edge and the concave inner edge on the toe. Okay, the rears are round, but the overall track shape, if you were to draw an outline, it would be sort of circular. And again, that's very similar. You can see this here in a collared peccary, okay? So some people refer to these as javelinas. But again, if I outline the entire track, I'll get more of a circular shape. I won't get that heart-shaped appearance. This is a front. Again, it's pretty difficult to tell the difference between a front and a hind. They're very close. The fronts are slightly larger and a little more round than the hinds, which are slightly narrower. Here's an example of a European boar track. This is a hind, and we can tell that because the dew claws are registering, and you can see how they're in the vertical position, pointing more that way than they are the horizontal. But if you look again, notice those dew claws land outside of the front toes. So again, that's a really easy way, in addition to looking at the other features like the tips of the toes, to differentiate from a deer or antelope. Here's an example of an African warthog. This is a hind, so obviously a wild species, but again, you can see the similarities. Same thing with the rounded tips. Okay, we've got that Pac-Man type shape and just overall round appearance of the track. And then finally, this is a domestic pig. Now, this one does have a slight heart shape. It's just the way that this one registered. But again, if I look at the tips there, I can see they're very rounded. And it just so happened the way this one registered, there's not as much negative space. So it appears a little more like a deer. But again, if I looked at those tips, I would see clearly that that's not a deer or antelope species. Let's look at bovine tracks and the key features that will help you identify them and tell the difference between them and other species. When we're discussing bovine tracks, we're really talking about any kind of wild cattle species. So these could be your bison, buffalo, and any sort of other wild cattle that you would have in Asia and or Africa, as well as domestic cattle. They all have the same features. So the first thing we want to note is that the front tracks are always going to be larger than the hind tracks. And this, of course, is because any sort of cattle species is going to have a really large chest cavity, a large head. Some species may have horns, and that's a lot of weight to support. So that's going to mean it needs a bigger surface area on the front feet to support that. So you'll always notice that. The other thing is the tracks are symmetrical. So again, if I draw a line right down the middle, they're going to line up the right to the left. Again, adjusting for some variations in the soil depth, etc., how the animal lands, but you're going to see consistently it's going to be exactly the same on either side. Also, like any other ungulate species, we're going to always see two toes that register on both the front track up above as well as the hind track below, okay? And in both cases, you're going to see this kind of oval shaped that's kind of long and then curves towards the top, okay? And so there's going to be obviously one on the left and one on the right. And it's really the same whether you look in the front or the hind. The front's just going to be, again, a little bit larger, a little bit rounder. But you can see there's no sharp edges on this whatsoever, okay? The other thing you're going to know is that the tips of the toes on any kind of bovine species are going to be rounded. And we can see that here in the peak line. It's not going to come to a point, okay? It's not going to taper like in deer or antelope species, okay? It's very round there. It's always going to have that kind of blunt appearance. And again, the same thing you're going to have on the hind foot below. It's going to be very round and not come to a point. Other thing to note is that the outer wall of each toe is going to be very convex. And this is a key way to be able to tell the difference between deer species, but also wild boar species. Now, all of them are convex on the outer toe, but you're going to have more curvature on bison species or in any kind of bovine species, any kind of wild cattle or domestic. Okay, it's going to curve all the way around. You can see that curvature continues all the way from sort of the middle part of the toe all the way up to the tip of the toe at the top. Okay, it's just going to be a pretty consistent curvature, which gives it that overall kind of circular shape that we were talking about. On the inside of the wall, again, it's going to be concave, okay? And again, that's very similar with any sort of other ungulate species. And so the other thing we want to note is difference between the front and hind tracks is that the front track is very, very round. Again, you can use this to differentiate this. A deer will not look like this. Occasionally, you might get an elk, which approximates this somewhat, but even boar species, they're going to be a little more oblong. These tracks in the front are very round. And in the hind, they're round also, as you can see down below with the blue line, but they're going to be a little bit narrower, okay? Not going to be quite as wide. And so you can look at that and tell the difference between the two. Also, unlike deer and antelope and even feral hogs, you typically get very little splay between the toes, even in the deepest substrate, okay? And so you only get a small amount of negative space, and you can see that with the light blue line here. We have the toes separate a little bit, but they don't spread out nearly as much as they do in other species. And just anatomically, they're just made that way. They don't splay as much, and maybe to support their huge weight gives them more stability. And because of that large weight, you're going to get oftentimes very deep impressions in the tracks. Okay, if you're in any sort of mud, they're going to sink way down. So if you had some deer or even some feral hogs nearby or some other boar species, you're going to note a difference not only in the size of the trap, because obviously cattle species are going to be larger, but you're also going to see that the depth of the track is going to be very different. So if you had impressions that were not clear, had trouble making out the features that we just talked about, that's another clue that you could use to help positively identify a bovine. And then finally, just to note that dew claws, they do have them, but because they're so high up on the leg, they're such large animals, they almost never register, only in very deep substrate, something like when you would have a deep snow, and that makes them very hard to see. So again, if you're in this deeper substrate, you don't see any dew claws, and you have this round track, that's very much a clue that you're probably looking at some sort of bovine species. Let's take a look at a few actual examples of bovine tracks. So here's an American bison. This is a front track. You can see how round it is. Again, that curvature starts on the outside, way on the outside of the toe, all the way up and around to the tip of the toe and just keeps curving in. Okay, a very round track. Here's a Cape buffalo in Africa. This is actually a hindfoot, and the immediate thing I see the difference is that it's a narrower track because it's a hind. Okay, it's not as overall as round, but the other features, the convexity on the outer shape of the toes, you can see it's concave on the inside. Again, very indicative of a cattle species. Here's an Asian water buffalo. This is in deeper mud. We do have a little bit of splay. This is about as much as you'll ever see. This is a front track. Again, it's very round. You can see the toes, again, are very rounded. In the lower left here, this is a gaur. These are from India. You can find them in other parts of Asia. This is a little more defined track, a little bit more tapered. Again, there are small variances in it, but still the tips are fairly round. And you can see this is a hind track because it's narrower. And then finally, just to compare a domestic cow, and this is a front track. Again, you can see how round it is. The toes are very round, not much negative space between the toes. And actually, you look at that compared to the bison track, and they're almost identical. It'd be very hard to tell them apart because, again, they're very closely related, and so they have the same general track characteristics. Let's take a look at lagomorph tracks and the key features you want to look for to recognize them and distinguish them from other species. So lagomorph tracks refers to any sort of rabbit or hare species. A lot of people use those interchangeably. They are different species, but for our sakes, they have the same track features and characteristics, so we can lump them together. And first thing we want to note is that the hind track is always going to be larger than the front. And that's because rabbits and hares spend most of their time, or a lot of it, bounding, which is very similar to gallop. And they really are able to push off and get their speed from the hind feet, so they're just larger. However, a lot of times you won't be able to see that because that is determined by whether or not the heel pad registers in the hind foot. And you can see here that the heel pad is really large on these species, but it doesn't always register. Okay, when it does, it looks like a human heel, and then it makes the hind track, which is the photo down below, much larger than the front track, the one above it. Also, the front track, when we look at the symmetry of it, is very asymmetrical. So if I draw a line down the middle and I compare the left-hand side to the right-hand side, they're not going to match up at all. Okay, the toes are in different orientation, and so you wouldn't be able to confuse that at all, left and right side. On the hind foot, it's slightly asymmetrical, but not nearly as much. It more closely lines up between the left and the right-hand side. Okay, on the front track, we actually have 5 toes that are oval shaped. And what they do, they form an upside down J shape. So if I take this J here and then I flip it upside down and I put it up here, you can see that that really forms around all of those toes that register, okay? And so I can outline them here, these sort of roundish oblong toes, and I'll see that toe 3 is what we refer to as the leading toe. That's the one at the top here in yellow. And then I've got toes on either side of it. And I can see here I've got that one lower toe on the outside, and that's where we get that upside down J. There also is an actual first toe on the inside, which is very small and very easy to miss. And you can see it here in this circle here on the lower part of that front track, okay? Many cases it doesn't show up, but if you look closely for it, you can see it. And this is really important actually because oftentimes rabbit tracks or hare tracks can be confused for a canine track, a smaller canine, particularly if they're not very well defined. Just the overall shape, it can be easy to confuse if you only get, let's say, the tips of the toes that register. But if you see that low toe there, that first toe, that'll tell you every time you're looking at a rabbit or a hare, okay? Now, when we look at the hind track, actually, it's a very different configuration, okay? It has 4 oval-shaped toes that form basically an arc or semicircular shape across the top, okay? And 2 of them are basically in line with each other at the top. And then on either side of them, we have 2 roundish, again, kind of oblong toes on either side of them. So again, it is slightly asymmetrical, but not nearly as much as the front. And the lowest toe will be on the outside of the foot. So again, these are both right feet. And you can see that even though it's more symmetrical than the front foot, we do have a low toe on the outside, but there's not a 5th toe. You won't see that show up like you do in the front foot. Okay, also, what you'll notice in most rabbit species, and some of them you'll see a huge amount of this, are hair that shows up, and it can make it very difficult actually to read the track and pick out individual features of toes or the pad. And you can see that here in this blue circle in the front foot. You can see it just looks like sort of paint brush strokes, and also in the hind foot here. And so that makes it hard sometimes to pick out those other features, actual toes, or distinguish the pad. But again, that's another clue that we can use to, let's say, differentiate between a canine track where there's only a couple species where you might see much fur in the track. Also, another thing to look for in rabbit and hare tracks is that the outline of the track often appears like a dome shape, especially on the front foot because we have that lead toe at the top. So you can think of almost like a capital shape. And again, when you don't have a well-defined track, this is something that you can look for to help you confidently identify it as a rabbit or a hare species. And then finally, if you look closely, oftentimes you will see little bitty nails on both the front and the hind track. So I can see in the front track here, just on the very tips of those toes, some small nail marks. In this hind track down below, they're a little bit larger, and so they stand out more. Again, it depends on the substrate. Sometimes you won't see these at all, but they are quite common to appear, and so they're wispy. You have to really look for them. But again, that's a clue to help you identify a rabbit or hare species versus other types of animals. Let's look now at some actual examples of rabbit and hare tracks. So here's a cottontail rabbit, okay, very common species. This is a front foot, and the first thing is you can really see that dome shape, okay, and that's because of that leading toe at the top. You can also see the upside down J. So these are all right feet, and you can see that toe on the lower right really stands out. Okay, it's hard to make out first toe on this one. I'm not sure it registered on this, but that tells you it's a front foot. And I can compare that to the hind foot of a cottontail here, and you can see 4 toes here that stand out, but you've got 2 across the top and then 2 on the outside, okay? So again, very different morphology from the front foot. Then if I take a look at another species, this is a swamp rabbit. So this is from the southeastern U.S. It's kind of like a very large version of a cottontail, but it is a distinct species. And I can see this is a front foot. I can see the leading toe at the top, and I can see that upside down J with 2 toes on either side of the leading toe and then an outer toe on the right-hand side. Again, this is a right track. I can also very clearly see in this track that low toe 1, that little bitty toe on the left side, okay, which again tells me this is a front foot and it's a right foot. And the other thing I can see are nail marks in all of these very clearly, and hair in the track. I can see lots of hair in a track. So again, this is really would help you distinguish between, let's say, a rabbit or hare and a canine. Here's an example in the lower left-hand corner of a jackrabbit hind. They're a much larger species, certainly than cottontails, but the morphology is the same. This is a hind foot, so again, I see 2 toes basically parallel to each other at top, and then 2 outer toes on either side of it. This is a snowshoe hare. This is also a hind foot, same configuration. I've got 2 toes at the top, roughly on par with each other, and then I've got 2 toes on the outside, and I can really see the shape of the hind heel pad here. That stands out very much so, and that's a clear indication that you have a hind foot. And then finally, this is a European hare. This is a front track. Again, if you look closely, you can see those 4 toes in the upside down J shape. Again, it's a right foot. You can especially see that low toe on the outside, and again, that dome shape. So that's very much a classic looking rabbit track and a front foot. Let's look at rodent tracks and the key features you'll use to identify them and distinguish them from other species. In this case, when we're looking at rodent tracks, we're discussing small to medium-sized rodents, okay? So these would be like your squirrels, your chipmunks, rats, mice, and various other smaller species. Some of the larger species have a little bit different morphology and different characteristics, but the features we're going to discuss here apply to almost all of these small to medium-sized species. So the first thing we're going to look at is symmetry. And if we draw a line down the middle of these tracks, again, we have a front at the top and a hind below, we'll see that there's a little bit of asymmetry. Not as much in the front track, although it doesn't line up completely between the left and the right. But if we see in the hind track down below, it's quite different. I mean, the number of toes are even different. So there's always some slight asymmetry. Then also we'll notice that with rodent tracks, we typically get somewhat of a curvature to the inside of the track. So if I draw a line from the bottom of this front track up through the top of it, I'll see that it kind of curves up into the inside. So these are both right tracks, and we can see that clearly here, that curvature. Then we'll also notice that the hind track is a little bit larger than the front track. And many rodent species have the preponderance of their weight more towards the back of the animal. So they support a little more weight there, so they have a little bit bigger hind feet, but it's only a slight difference. It's not a huge variation. When we look at the front track, we'll notice that it actually has 4 long or round toes, and we can see that there's 2 inner toes here, which are pretty much in line at the top. Okay, if you drew a line across the top of them, there's no clear leading toe, and we'll see there's lots of negative space both between them and between 2 outer toes here, right? Now the outer toes point more towards the outside, and you can see the difference with the inner toes, which point more north and south, okay? But they're really spread out, lots of negative space between them. Additionally, with the front tracks of rodents, sometimes we can actually make out a small round dot below. Now this one registered really well. It's bigger than most of them, but if you look at that red circle, that's actually a 5th toe. Oftentimes it doesn't register. It's very easy to miss. It's on the inside of the track. Again, this is a right foot, but you can look for it a lot of times and you will see just a little small dot there. Okay, it's kind of similar to the front feet of rabbits. Okay, it's very easy to miss. When we look at the hind foot, we'll see actually there are 5 toes which register very reliably. Okay, they're all robust, and 3 of them will register almost exactly in a line across the top, and you can see that here. There's no clear leading toe, and then we have 2 toes which register on the outside, and they typically will point a little bit more to the outside than these toes do, but again, there's some variation. Every track's a little bit different, but you can see they're clearly below the inner toes and outside of them. Also, again, when we look at the palm pad, we can see that on the front foot, it has a triangular shaped palm pad, and those are made up of 3 distinct round pads, individual pads inside of there. So they showed up really well in this particular track, and if you drew an outline around all of them, the blue line, you see you get this triangular shape. Oftentimes you'll also get 2 round heel pads which show up below them. And again, these registered really well. So a lot of times they're not there or they're harder to make out, but in deeper substrate in mud, and again, many rodent species will spend a lot of time in mud, you can look for them because they do register frequently. Okay, the hind foot has similar in terms of a large palm pad, but it's actually more of an arc shape. Okay, and it's a little bit bigger, which is why the track's a little bit larger than the front pad, and it's actually made up of really, you can oftentimes make up 4 distinct pads that will make up that pad. Okay, and so when you see that on the hind track, a lot of times you won't see the individual ones, but you'll get this overall arc shape, which is clear. And then below it, you'll often find 2 heel pads, just like in the front track. Okay, again, they don't always register, but again, you want to look for them because it's a clear indication of a rodent when you see that. And then finally, a lot of times with rodents, you will see the nail marks register, okay? Now, not always. Sometimes they won't be there, but when they do register, they can either be sharp or in this case, they're more blunt. So if I look on the front track here, I'll see a fairly large nail on one of the inner toes and then a smaller claw mark on the outer toe. If I look down below, I can see some really large nail marks, okay? They're blunt, but they clearly stick out on this track. So again, they're not always there, but you want to look for them. Let's look at some actual examples now of some small to medium-sized rodents. So the first one here, we have a squirrel, and this is the front foot of a squirrel. We can see there's 4 toes. The 2 at the top are kind of in a line, and you've got 2 on the outside, which point at an angle about 45 degrees. You can clearly see nail marks, and you can see the palm pad there, the 3 individual kind of round palm pads that make up that triangle shape. Plus, you can actually see 2 heel pads down below it. Then here's a chipmunk. This is actually a hind, and you can see the difference here with the squirrel front foot next to it, that this chipmunk has 5 toes, okay? 3 across the top and then 2 on the outside. You can see the nail marks clearly above those. And then you can see that sort of arc-shaped across the top of the palm pad on the hind, which is made up of those 4 individual palm pads inside. And you can see an outline of heel pad below it. Here's a groundhog, okay? Again, this is a front. It's got 4 toes. Can't make out a lot of features on the inside of it, but clearly you can see the palm pads, which registered there down below, and gives you the overall outline of the track. Here's an example of an old world rat. This is, when we call those are black rats or brown rats. Again, this is a hind foot. Again, 3 toes across the top, pretty much in line. And then notice the 2 toes on the outside, and they're really pointing to the outside on that. So that's very typical of rat species. This is an example now in the lower left-hand corner of a wood rat. They have a little bit more round toes. You can see this one didn't register as clearly. A lot of times you won't see those toes connected all the way down to almost the palm pad, but you can see there's 4 of them, 2 at the top and 2 on either side. And again, you can see those 3 individual palm pads, which if you drew a line between them would form a triangle, plus 2 heel pads, and also you can see that 5th toe on the lower left-hand part of the track, right? Just a round dot. So it doesn't always show up, but you can clearly see it here. This is a hispid cotton rat, which is sort of a smaller rat. Again, it's a front foot, so just like the wood rat next to it, we can see the 4 toes. You can see little bitty nail marks above, and you can clearly see that triangular-shaped palm pad and just a little bit of 2 heel pads below it. And also you can just see a tiny dot of the 5th toe that registers on kind of the lower left there, just above the heel pads. These are all right feet again, by the way, but you can actually make that out. And then finally, this is a harvest mouse. It's a small track. And you can see again that this is particularly a hind, 3 toes across the top and then 2 on the outside. And you can see that curvature. If you draw a line from the bottom to the top, again, this is a right foot, you can see that it would, as you go from the bottom to the top, it would start to curve up and towards the inside, the midline of the animal. Let's take a look now at the key features you want to look for to identify bird tracks and how to tell the difference between them and other animal families. In the case of bird tracks, we're going to focus on 3 categories of birds. And those are going to be your columbidae, which are your doves and your pigeons, your game or land fowl, which includes your turkeys, pheasants, and quail, and your waterfowl, which are various ducks and geese species. And so we see an example of all 3 here on the right-hand side. And the first thing we notice is that when we draw a line down the center, that all of them are slightly asymmetrical. Now, some are more than others, but when we compare the left-hand side to the right-hand side, we'll see it doesn't exactly match up, either because of the curvature or maybe just a little bit of size difference in one of the toes, but there's a little bit of asymmetry, again, some more than others. So the first we're going to focus on is at the top here are what's known as classic bird tracks, and those are your doves and your pigeons. And they have 3 toes in front, and we can see those clearly here. So if you drew a line in the middle of the track going horizontal, you would see that there's 3 toes that would be above that line, okay? And then actually we'll notice that there's also below, there's 1 toe that points to the south, if you will, and that's known as the hallux. And we'll see as well that in the center there's something which we call a metatarsal pad. Now, it doesn't always register. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not, okay? But typically we're going to see maybe some sort of vague outline of it. So the other thing that we'll notice with classic bird tracks is that you have this curvature of the track, which if you start from a bottom and draw a line up to the top of the track, we'll see that it would curve towards the midline of the animal. animals. So these are all right tracks that we show here, and you can clearly see that curvature. And because of that, and these birds typically walk a lot, it makes sort of a wavy line if you followed the trail of the bird, sort of almost like a sinusoidal wave if you were looking at it in the vertical. The next track down below is a game and landfowl track, okay? And again, these are your turkeys, your pheasants, or your quail. And they also have 3 forward straight toes, and we can see those outlined here. They're almost always, you'll see all 3 of them that will register. They do have a hallux, but in many cases it doesn't register, that you won't see it. And again, that's a rear toe, which would be underneath and facing to the bottom. And the reason for that is because it's high up on the leg, so it doesn't always register. We also have a segmentation which shows up in the toes. And if you look closely here, they almost look like ribs. You can see these little lines that go across the toes. So that's a really good indication that you have some sort of game or landfowl type of track. Then also we do have a metatarsal pad. It's usually visible. In many cases, the toes won't connect to it, and you can see that here with the blue circle. So it's usually some sort of round hub, if you will, where all the toes would converge if you connected them all the way to the middle, and that's common with all bird tracks. So typically in the game and landfowl, you'll always see an outline of that metatarsal. And then the final track here at the bottom is an example of a waterfowl track. So again, these are your ducks and your geese. They also have, like all bird species, 3 toes that are forward facing, pointing mostly north, and you can see them outlined here. Okay, and they also have a hallux as well, but in many cases the hallux may not show up. We do see this one showing up. You can see it's just a small little segment here. It's also high up on the leg, like it is with game and landfowl, so it doesn't consistently register. And then in addition to that, we have a metatarsal pad. Again, it's sort of the hub here where all the toes converge on, but it doesn't always show up. So you may not see it. Sometimes you will, sometimes you won't, depending on the substrate and, just how the bird landed. And then finally, the big key with waterfowl to distinguish them from other species is that the forward toes have full or complete webbing. And we can really see that in this particular track, where you can see the top 3 toes, the forward-facing ones, are all connected. You can clearly see the webbing outline. Sometimes you won't see it as clear as this, or you only see it between 2 of the toes and not all 3, but you want to look for this, and if you see this, you know for certain then that you're looking at some sort of waterfowl type species. Let's look at some actual examples of bird tracks of the 3 categories that we spoke of. So this is a mourning dove. And this is actually a left foot in this case, and you can see that curvature. You can see all 3 of the forward-facing toes pointing, and you can actually see the hallux below it. And again, if I drew a line from the bottom and going up to the top, it would curve up towards the inside of the animal. So that's clearly a left foot. This is an example next to it of a pigeon, very similar track. This is a right foot though, and you can see the different curvature, right? In this particular case, we've got all 3 toes, forward-facing toes, clearly showing, but we barely have an imprint of the rear-facing toe, the hallux, right? And can't really make out maybe a little bit of the metatarsal pad there in the middle, but barely registering. Okay, now you can compare those 2 to this wild turkey track, and this is a left foot. You can see again 2 toes, forward-facing toes, clearly registering, and you can see a little bit of the outline of that 3rd forward-facing toe. And if you look closely down below, you can see a little bit of an imprint of a hallux, just a little bit lower down and to the right of that rock. And so it barely registered. You can also make out the metatarsal pad just next to the other rock to the left of it, a little bit of a round indentation, okay? But it's easy to miss both of those. One thing that I want to point out is you can clearly see the segmentation in the toes, particularly that middle toe that's pointing straight up due north there. So again, that's a really good indication that you've got some sort of game or landfowl. Then here's another example of game or landfowl. This is a ringneck pheasant. This is a right track, and this is a really good track because, again, you can see all 3 forward-facing toes, but you can also see the hallux down below it. Okay, again, this is a right foot, and so you can really see even a little bit of segmentation in there as well. Then down below in the lower left hand, we have another game fowl. This is a scaled quail. This is a right foot. Can't really make out a hallux there, but you can see, in addition to the 3 forward-facing toes, you can actually see that metatarsal pad which registered, and you can see a little bit of the segmentation in those toes as well. And then finally, if we want to look at a couple examples of some waterfowl, here's a mallard duck. This is a right foot, and again, we can see all 3 forward-facing toes, as well as just a little bit of a hallux that registers in the lower left there. The metatarsal shows up clearly, and then up above the 3 forward-facing toes, you can actually see the webbing that connects those 3 toes. So on both sides of the track, on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, you can make out that webbing. And then finally, we have a Canadian goose here. This is actually a left foot. Again, you can see all 3 forward-facing toes clearly. The hallux actually came out really clear in this one, down below those toes. And then you can see a little bit of the webbing. You can just see the outline of where the debris is in the track that shows where the curvature is connecting those toes. So again, you always want to look for that. If you see that full webbing like that, you know that you have some sort of water bird, waterfowl.
If you enjoyed this video, remember to click on the link in the description below to download your free resource that covers everything I talked about, plus more. You can take it with you whenever you head out into the field, whether that be on your own land, local park, or in a wilderness setting. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more valuable videos like this, as well as visit our website, that's naturaliststudies.com, for more information and a list of our online courses.